afternoon, evening. Welcome to all for attending this webinar. We are very looking forward to hearing from our invited speaker today, Dr. Syed Mohammed, who will be speaking on the emission transition. So in the meantime, while our other friends should join in, I want to introduce the firm. The firm is an 80-year-old assurance advisory business with 6 offices all over the country. We are an organization which is extremely deeply steeped in history and in heritage, and we are a part of the ESG practice. The ESG practice does research on various aspects of environmental and social aspects of the responsible capitalism paradigm. And in the recent months, we have published white papers on ESG reporting and also on carbon-related activities. And we are indeed speaking to the climate zeitgeist of the times. And at the moment, we have been doing a few webinars. We in fact completed a webinar series of 5 episodes on BRSR, which is the Indian variant of ESG reporting, in the month of December and in early January. And the webinar recordings are on a website, in fact, whose link will be plugged into the chat box by my team. And you can have a look at the webinar recordings from our website, which is recently just went live, and also on our social media feeds. So as far as, not to take any more time away from our speaker is the respected Syed Mohammed. He has a PhD in policy and engineering. He teaches at the Georgetown campus in Qatar, and he's a renowned expert in sustainable transitions with a particular focus on the Middle East. And he does work in relation to the energy and power sectors over there. And we are indeed extremely delighted to invite him to this webinar series of ours. This webinar is purely educational in purpose. It's for outreach and information, and the observations and the analysis of the speaker are entirely the speakers itself. And we are indeed very keen to hear from Professor Said on it for the next 30 to 40 minutes, post which we will have a small dialogue with the participants over here. So I will more than happily pass on the virtual floor to Prof. Said. Prof. Said, if you can share your screen.
Yes, thank you so very much. Thank you for the invitation. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And I'm delighted that you are here. And thank you for taking time on Friday evening. We're all rushing to take our weekends off. I'm glad that you are still here. And I will try to make sure that, your time is worth it. And before, I just wanted to make a kind of a small disclaimer that, in abstract, in the presentation, in the program briefing that we've mentioned, that I will talk about the Middle East. But apparently, I'm still kind of in the phase of collecting data, and there are some kind of challenges in data verification and quality. So I can't able to talk much about the Middle East, but hopefully soon there are a few papers that will come out talking about the transition from energy. And they will talk and they will share with with you. So about an intensive industry and what kind of changes are happening, and how the industry will be badly affected, if we don't take enough actions. And this is what I will talk about, and some of the key policy measures and key technologies that will shape the industry in the coming few decades. And again, if you are not familiar with the whole revolutions like in industries, like what we are seeing today in terms of the industry, the chemical industry, cement, steel, metal, all of these industries are kind of a very old industries, almost 150 to 200 years old. Like some of the oldest ones are steel, and the much latest ones are chemical industries. Again, they're 100 years old industry, and a lot of things have developed over time. Like if you compare with the industry, some 20, 30 years back, they're far different than what we have today. So there is a gradual technological development over the years. But what we really need, like if we really wanted to transition to kind of to a future that is fully decarbonized and and address all the climate change issues, then the current state of technological growth is still very limited. We'll talk more about that in the slides. So the current status of greenhouse gas emissions is that we are still, there is no sign of drop in our emissions. Only with the COVID, we have seen that emissions have slowed down for a while. And also, again, the emissions rebounded within a year's time. So the COVID was a kind of a good idea to understand, how quickly we can change our policies and what we really need to do. And we are starting to take lessons from COVID. Even the industries have been taking lessons, and they realize that they really need to be agile, and they need to be more forward looking if they really wanted to stay in the business, else they will be kind of being kind of out from business, and they will be taken. Some other companies and some other sectors will take over. This is something that's going to happen. And the good thing is that the emissions are slowing down compared to if you look at the previous decades, from 2000 to 2010. And there's a lot of policies, the technological changes and developments, voluntary action by the industry, the carbon market. All of them are, some of these factors are slowly changing slowing the growth of emissions, but it's still not good enough. And what are the major contributors of emissions? The population growth rate, and the other biggest contributor in greenhouse gas emissions is our wealth. In terms of GDP per capita, are the two major contributors of greenhouse gas emissions. And to kind of negate the effect of these two, the energy and emission intensity of the overall economy and the society is kind of helping, but it's not good enough. If you really wanted to see the growth, the emissions are fully decarbonized. So we still have a long way to go. And these are the thing, and the industry is one of the key contributors to these emissions, and we'll see how it is. And this is from the latest IPCC report on sectoral emissions that was published last year on the sixth report, the sixth assessment report. And if you look at the industry contributes almost 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions. But if I take into consideration of the indirect emissions, primarily which comes from our electricity as well, then almost 1/3 of the emissions come from the industry. And that's quite substantial amount of the emissions that we are talking about. And that's enough for, there should be enough focus on these sectors. And also, they are one of the major contributors to global GDP. They produce almost 1/4 of the global GDP. And three industries alone, contribute 60% of all the industrial emissions we are talking about, chemicals, steel, and cement. And then a few others come from other sectors as well. And also interestingly, and in the last few years, we have seen that the industrial focus, the industry has been shifted mostly to developing countries. China is taking the lead. If you look at the overall steel production, cement, aluminum, all of them, China is taking the lead, followed by India, Brazil, and all of them. So 80% of these industrial emissions come from developing countries and 20% from developed countries. And here, so this is the you can see the kind of 1/3 of the emissions come from industrial sector, which includes the indirect emissions. And three sectors along with aluminum and all of them contributes over 75% of the sectors. Like if you just focus on these four key sectors alone, so we're going to make a huge change in global greenhouse gas. Seems there is kind of some issue with the internet, I guess. It seems the internet keeps breaking. I'm not sure if you could able to face the same problem. Again, like, these three sectors, if you just look at, they contribute, like, they are 40% of the global energy demand. And like, these three sectors, energy consumption is almost equivalent to the total energy demand from the United States alone. And because of our growth in energy consumption, because of our growth in industrial activities, and the demand for, the population growth and the demand from developing countries will continue to rise, like, the growth in infrastructure projects like cement, steel, aluminum, and also like the chemical industry with the plastics, all these things continue to grow. So there is a very little hope that, like, if we don't really change our production processes, like, with policies and everything, so we will continue to see a huge emissions coming from these three sectors alone. So here I just wanted to let why we are more concerned about it. And we are all kind of aware of the climate change, but like, I wanted to kind of highlight two particular concepts, like, that is really, really worrying. And we don't really see that much conversation happening. Only in the last 2-3 years, we're talking about the net zero targets. We're talking about decarbonization, but these key things will just for you to understand the current status of global climate. And if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, and these are like these are some from the latest UNEP report and the global emissions gap report, and where they've kind of identified like the emissions we really need to kind of reduce almost 23 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Like, if we really wanted to stick to 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature, well below 1.5 degrees Celsius. But the sad thing is that, like, even despite like all the increased ambition through our NDC submissions last year and in Glasgow summit, we still like far away from reaching the target. We are still going to kind of like emit an additional 23 billion tons of CO2 emissions. And why is it a worrying concern? But because like we have very limited carbon budget in the atmosphere. I mean, like if you really wanted to keep the temperature like 1.5 degrees Celsius, like assuming that like 50% likelihood, then we have only 380 gigatons of CO2 emissions that we can emit. And then like if you want to keep 1.5, then like the number keeps increasing with that one. But again, if you just look at the budget, will increase the budget as much as you want. But the problem is that we are going to see a climate runaway situation where the temperatures will quickly accelerate and lead to some sort of like, tipping point. I'm not sure how many of them are familiar with it. And we are going to see that climate works in a very non-linear way. And like, we are going to see a major, like, transgressing some of these planetary boundaries and the tipping points. And like, if you just look at some of these tipping points on the upper quadrant over here, and these are take some of them like, millions of, like, thousands of years and like, to change. And, but again, like, any of the greenhouse gas emission changes over here, we are going crossing this threshold, which will cause these tipping points. And it's not something that like, even if you stop greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, the complete stoppage of emissions, still like you're going to witness some of these greater ecological damages, like, that will last for at least 2,000, 3,000 years, particularly like in terms of like, the ocean anoxic events, and then the West Antarctic ice sheet loss. These are like some of major events that already some scientists are predicting that, like, with the existing trajectory of emissions, we are going to see that by 2070 and 2080. And because it's not the linear way that the climate works, and the new research done by Lenton that was published recently, and he really argues, I guess, like he spoke recently in the World Economic Forum, arguing that like we can't really go the way that we are going. So there is this greater urgency that we really need to take into consideration. And the time frame that we have for the industrial sector that we are looking at is very limited, and it's fairly limited. And also, I'm not saying that we need to stop producing it, but we really need to find a more equitable pathway for the industry to move forward. So to really avoid the climate catastrophe and to not to cross the climate thresholds, so we really need a structural transformation. We're talking about nowadays like the net zero, we're talking about transition, and we really need that, and we really need it very fast. But again, transitions are extremely complex, extremely chaotic. It's not a linear process. It's again a very non-linear process. It's always faced with a lot of setbacks, with barriers. You have a lot of vested interests. So many people like industry lobbies, all of them make changes. They always wanted more time for them to transition to avoid any economic consequences. If you are not familiar with the climate politics, the way that the reason why it took almost 20 years, 25 years to have a binding agreement for climate change, because different industries, different countries, nation states have different national interests, and for them to protect their national interests, their industries, and their population. And these are some of the things that really limit tangible and ambitious climate action. But now in the last 5 years, particularly since the Paris Agreement, we are starting to see that as a change, all the countries, even both developed and developing countries, they realize that we cannot really continue the way we are. And again, there is a kind of a tendency for us to focus more on marginal changes. We can do some small changes, but we still are not ready for structural changes in our society, the way we run, the way our businesses are operating, how we produce our products and services. All those things are continue to go on, but there is a greater flux. I'm not saying that not everything is bad. There is a greater flux. There is a whole lot of dialogue has been emerging in the last 2-3 years, particularly since the pandemic. We are seeing even an International Energy Agency, which usually comes up with lukewarm warnings about climate change, but in the latest report, they made it very certain that we really need to take immediate action, and also our actions should be far-reaching. Just marginal actions are not good enough. They're no longer talking about energy efficiency anymore. Energy efficiency was used to be one of the key aspects, for almost from 2007 up until 2017-18, and this is what they keep saying it okay, improve energy efficiency of the industry, that will be good enough. Now you can see, we'll show you in the next slides, energy efficiency is no longer the major thing. They're talking about something much more, a fundamental restructuring of the industrial activities we are talking about. And here on the other side, you can see there is this a major reinforcing loops that's happening. And some of them are creating a virtuous cycle, helping to transition quite rapidly. And the other end, where the dying industries that we are talking about, the oil and gas industry, primarily the coal industry is kind of a dying industry. There are so many things are reinforcing the existing state and putting an end to that sector completely. And so this is what we're going to see, from now up until 2030. These feedback loops, the positive and negative feedback loops, will continue to strengthen and amplify their effect on the industry. The industries that are contributing for positive climate change, they will soon die out, and because of these positive feedback loops. Whereas the carbon neutral industries, carbon neutral technologies will get a far better support from that one. And this is what is going to happen. We are facing a kind of two pull and push factors of both downward and upward spiral of actions that we are seeing it. And for the industries the carbon intensive and the energy intensive industries, we are talking about steel, aluminum, and all of them, they are under greater threat, and they've been under constant under scrutiny now in the last few years. And the global climate policies, particularly the Paris Agreement, is forcing this industry to rethink that the way they are doing it. And the investors are they no longer want to bet their money into that industry. And there is a major flight in terms of both capital and skills flight. People are moving away from this industry. And they're moving particularly to the renewable energy, like, to batteries, to all other sectors, where it's going to contribute much positively, to the global environment. And also, the cost of production is becoming high. I'll talk about the reason. One of the reasons why is it becoming high because of the carbon taxes and other regulatory requirements are becoming extremely difficult for these industries to operate and to gain revenues and net profits as well. And also, the investors are writing down their assets, there is early write down of assets. And this is something we're going to see more and more in the next few years' time. And particularly the coal industry is under greater threat. And most of the investing agencies and then banks, like international banks, multilateral banks like World Bank, and all of them are shifting away and stopping their funding to coal-based or any carbon-intensive sectors. Whereas, on the other hand, we are seeing a more positive growth, the clean technologies, particularly the solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles. All of them are seeing a kind of a rapid jump in terms of their uptake, both by the policymakers, by corporates as well. And then the capital is flowing in because they see that these are growing industries. This is the same thing that what Joseph Schumpeter has said back in the 1930s in his book on capitalism, democracy, and technological development. And much recently, the Carlota Perez, she talked about in technological revolutions and financial systems. And she talked about when the big investors, big financiers put their money into the new technologies, then we are going to see that we are at the cusp of the technological revolution. And this is what we are seeing currently now. And there is a greater shift in the overall investment climate. And because they see that the positive benefits, in terms of creating jobs and in terms of creating new industries, all of them are gaining some sort of a political support, and the leaders are creating some sort of a policy mechanism and subsidies and incentives for these sectors to grow. And obviously, it's helping overall climate change. The naming and shaming that we are seeing in the fossil fuel industry is kind of shifted more towards global praise and recognition. And this is something that we have seen recently in Abu Dhabi as well, where they're quickly shifting to blue ammonia, green ammonia. All these new things are kind of attracting major investors to the region. So we are seeing this transformative change when it comes to technology. You can see the solar uptake, just increased quite from insignificant quantity, less than 20, 30 gigawatts to almost we are seeing nearly 750 gigawatts of energy in less than 10 years time. And this is kind of beyond what our International Energy Agency, World Energy Outlook, and all of these big agencies have predicted. And this is something kind of a positive hope that that we are seeing that there is a possibility that we can really contain the growth of greenhouse gas emissions because of the rapid technological developments, the cost reduction. If you just look at these graph over here, there is a huge reduction in cost that we are seeing it. It's almost comparable to fossil fuel power generation. Again, the disadvantage of renewables we're all familiar with, which I don't want to go. And also, if you look at the energy sectors, the big energy companies, and in their percentage over S&P 500, the Standard & Poor 500, their sectors grow. I mean, the contribution is declining quite rapidly in the last 10 years time. So we are seeing that energy, the fossil-based sectors are no longer in the kind of a good eyes of investors and in the global stock market. And the other good thing, the technological developments, you can see that within a very short time, there is an explosion of technological developments, here, electric vehicles, batteries, these are all kind of a virtuous cycles. The increase in solar panels will increase in growth in batteries, and then the increase in growth in batteries will result in drop down on prices. And this kind of a constant virtuous cycle will help to reduce the overall price of the clean technologies, and also the uptake of corporates or the policymakers as well. Whereas if you look at the fossil fuels overall, we are seeing a declining trend in number of patents from fossil-based technologies. And these are data from the European Patent Office. And this is something that many people are concerned that if there is no technological development, then we are not going to see major investments into the sector as well. So coming back to the energy intensive industry, we are so many scenarios that we are looking at. And again, these scenarios, the one that you see on the first graph that you see here is basically for the global industry. And we really kind of have to make a rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but again, it's really impossible. And these are some of the different scenarios that we are looking at, how quickly the greenhouse gas emissions will decline. So again, if you really want to completely decarbonize, the shell sky scenario says that it will take at least another 50 years for us to decarbonize it. That's a very long time that we are talking about it. And if it continue to emit the same way that we are doing, even with all this technological developments, we are not in a good shape, unfortunately. We are not in a good shape. So, and the carbon intensity reduction, we are seeing some changes, but again, it's not good enough. It's not fast enough reduction in CO2 carbon intensity per production of these carbon intensive products. One of the key things that are shaping the energy intensive industry, Paris Agreement is one of the key factors. If you look at European Union, all the latest documents and the reports, the Green New Deal, it's all going back to Paris Agreement, and they're all kind of trying to find a more meaningful pathway, and where they wanted to shift from fossil-based to low carbon-based technologies. And particularly the Ukrainian and the Russian energy crisis has amplified this whole thing, and where the energy security aspect, the decarbonization is no longer a good environmental thing. It has become an environmental security. It has become an energy security and national security issue. And the industries that have been historically dependent on Russia's natural gas, both for feedstock, for power generation, and urea, ammonia, all of these things, which the industry, the European industry was dependent on, now facing a major threat. So the decarbonization is now taken a completely new turn, at least at a European level, as a more of a security issue rather than as a global climate policy goal. And the other things that are really shaping the decarbonization pathways at a global level, the national and subnational policies, because all the countries except for one or two, thanks for the US to joining to the Paris Agreement, all of them are dependent or have signed up for Paris Agreement. So all of them have certain targets. If you see that more and more countries are signing up for net zero targets. And so this net zero targets, may not necessarily be translating into ambitious policies, but at least these targets are kind of giving some sort of market signals to the energy intense industry that if they don't really kind of align to the net zero targets or science-based climate targets, then the industry will no longer be in the favor of in the financial industry or in investors' interests as well. So they will pull out all the funding, then the industry will eventually collapse. So this firm level response is growing very fast, and this is something we are seeing quite rapidly. There is enough evidence at an European level, the changes that the industries have taken, and considerable research needs to be done. If you wanted to look at Asia, and particularly for the community who are based in India, I really recommend you to read the reports that was published by Center for Science and Environment, and where they have really published a fantastic report. But it's a bit old report that was published 7 to 8 years back, before the Paris Agreement. And still the industry, because most of the technologies the Indian companies, the funds have put down, they are very fairly new, and they had this competitive advantage of getting the best available technologies. And that helps to kind of reduce the overall emission intensity. But again, if you really wanted to kind of keep the emission well below 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's not good enough, what we are looking at. So again, where most of our emissions will come from and where we're going to see, the developing countries, as I said, 80% of the industrial output comes from the developing countries. So now, the focus will significantly be focused on these region. And again, the developed countries need to do a lot because of the historical emissions and their historical responsibility that is primarily follows the principle of UNFCCC, but the focus need to look at India, China, and all other emerging economies, that has this major industries, and also the distributive impact that we are looking at. We can't really just decarbonize easily. That's one part, the technology part, but we're looking at the social element, which is like a loss of jobs, loss of revenues, and how is it going to affect, premature write down of assets. All these things will have a major social, political, and socio-economic impact. So one needs to take into consideration of all those things. It's not very simple that we look at purely from an environmental perspective, but there is a whole socio-economic and socio-political angle. When we talk about transition, that's why I mentioned earlier that transitions are extremely complex. It's not purely replacing technology or changing something so it goes far beyond technological boundaries. And again, there is this kind of a tendency for many people, particularly in corporates, in some big associations, to put enough emphasis on technology, but a lot of other things do matter and influence changes at a firm level and at a national policy level as well. So what kind of a pathways are we looking at? And this is something very important to understand. Again, the transition pathways, for different sectors vary. Some sectors, we are going to see, if you look at the power sector for some countries, again, it depends on country to country. What I'm saying here is not could be applicable to all the regions, to all the countries. Each country will find what's best a pathway for them. And again, there is no single pathway. There are there is always pluralistic pathways, the transition pathways, we look at it. And this one of the latest report by European Union, where they look at their own industry, particularly the carbon intensive industries, and they propose three possible pathways, for this industry. And one focusing on material efficiency, changing the entire process itself, where we're looking at completely new feedstock. Instead of relying on the fossil-based feedstock, we're going to look at bio feedstock, like wood, lignin, cellulose, all these different type of things, and looking at hydrogen as a feedstock. And again, all this process will be changed. Whatever the technologies that we have developed so far, it's purely based on fossil-based technologies. So there are some things that we can still use the existing technologies, existing assets, for ammonia, we can use the existing assets. But whereas if you're looking at bio-based feedstock, that is quite impossible. So we really need to shift to completely new technologies. The other thing we are looking at is much more a circular economy. Again, circular economy is another new phrase that has kind of quickly propped up in the last few years. But historically, many developing countries have been embracing the concept of circular economy for a very long time in different domains, like in agriculture and other sectors, whereas in industry, it's completely different. And now, there's a renewed focus on circular economy, where we need to kind of recirculate the materials. We design better products, we design better services, better products, that are easily kind of recycled again and again. With the current model of production of any of these energy intensive products are not easily recyclable, except steel and aluminum. Most likely. But whereas if you look at plastic, it's extremely hard for us to kind of do any mechanical recycling or chemical recycling. So we really need to change our methods. We need to change and make our products that is much more could be reused again, instead of developing entirely new. And the third pathway is carbon capture. We will continue to go on what we are doing it, but we'll just fix additional technologies at a tailpipe emissions, where we can able to kind of capture as much of carbon dioxide, convert it into either reuse, which we call a CCU, carbon capture and utilization, or perhaps we use it for storage in geological reservoirs. And this is something many fossil-based companies are looking at, because they don't really want to write down their assets. They don't want to kind of shut down the businesses. And carbon capture and storage is kind of a new darling of all the fossil-based companies, because they will continue to make money. They will continue to retain the business and the share. But the target of reaching net zero, or adhering to Paris Agreement, it will be still fulfilled. but the biggest challenge here with the carbon capture is that, like, it's not readily available, and the technology is still immature. Like, only a few pilot tests have been done here and there, but the technology, again, as I said, like, with this increasing policy shifts and everything, there is a lot of focus on new patents, on new technologies, and new capture methods, and new usage of carbon dioxide is emerging as well. And again, like, how much emissions that we can possibly reduce. Like, here you can just see the timeline for reduction. Like, we are not going to talk about, like, immediate reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. It will take at least, like, 30 to 40 years. Like, we are talking about like one investment cycle. So which takes, like, nearly 40 to 50 years time to really see a complete decarbonization of the industry. And because of various reasons, like, and these are like, these are two part of the figure that you need to look at it. And these are the global greenhouse gas emissions, like, that might increase by 2050. Like, we are going to see additional 39% increase in greenhouse gas emissions. But these are, like, different mitigation measures that we are looking at. Again, like, you can see the carbon capture and storage will remain one of the key aspects, and the energy efficiency and all other different technologies will kind of contribute to reduction, overall, like 95% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But the biggest concern is that, like, how much of the technology is commercially available. Like, again, like, how much is commercially available kind of keeps changing from one person to another, one kind of like political camps to another, whereas some groups, they say that, like, we have all the available technologies, like, to decarbonize immediately, and particularly like climate activists and all of them. But like the cost of those technologies is extremely high, which kind of like, major deterrent for the industry. Why I need to put like almost like, another $5 billion to clean up, like, how much I'm going to get return, and how long will it take for me to get this return of the investment. So all these things are like, the political dynamics that we've kind of fairly take into consideration. And so most of the technologies still at a very limited phase. Like, you're talking about like almost 50% of the technologies are still like at the prototype and demonstration scale, like it's not commercially available. Only a small part of them, like you can see, it's like mature, like, because again, all this energy intensive industry, one must understand they're extremely like, what do you call, you can't really play with these big processes. Like, it has major health, major like, the environmental impact. Like, if something goes wrong, like, the industry might explode, like there will be major fire incidents and all of them. So the industry is always risk averse, and like, trying to implement any of immature or like prototype technologies until like it's commercially viable. It's been tried and tested like, hundreds of times in different places, and it works because of like, the economic, health, and other ramifications that we're going to see. And again, like, as I said, like, hydrogen and CCS is going to be a force to reckon with. And we are going to see all the, like, if you really wanted to kind of achieve the net zero, and the current trajectory is that, like, we're going to see most of that focus will be on CCS, all the new technologies, like even the clean coal technologies, power plants are being equipped with carbon capture and storage. And because of like, the whole political angle to energy security. And then like hydrogen, in the last few years, hydrogen is kind of the latest of the hype cycle that we are seeing a change. But now it is slowly transitioning from a hype to more of a reality. Like, more and more industries are like betting their efforts like in hydrogen. And only in the last 2 years, like, you can see the number of reports related to hydrogen has exploded, like, at all the international conferences, like, by the institutions like EU, IEA, and all of them. So we're going to see a major change. Like, if we manage to find a much more cost-effective way of dealing with hydrogen, like, in terms of its safety, infrastructure, and all of them. So it will be definitely a game changer, and like along with carbon capture and storage. So then we can say some like there is some positive outlook to the industry. So this is where like many industry, particularly like, the IE and all of them are very optimistic that like, we could able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, whereas many activists and academics are kind of very skeptical about like, the growth of technologies. It's not very easy to mature quite quickly. So in terms of policies, like, I talked about the Paris Agreement and the net zero. The other biggest policy that, like, making a huge change is the carbon pricing. And some countries, again, like, the carbon pricing is kind of like, coming back, like, it's been resurrected from the dead, like, time and time again, like, through CDM projects, through ETS mechanism and all of them. But overall, like, there is a kind of upward trajectory when it comes to carbon pricing, and it's been touted as one of the key instrument for changing, for, like, shifting the emission trajectory. Like, even the latest IPCC report has talked extensively about carbon pricing as one of the means. And this will put a huge, like, impact on the industry, because for each ton of emission, like, you're going to pay a substantial amount of money. Like, again, like, the pricing rate varies significantly, like, especially if you have a national carbon pricing, like, it could range from like $1 per ton to almost $137. And again, like, European countries, like, Sweden, like, which has the $137, and like Switzerland, Norway, all of these countries are, like, trying to increase the carbon price, like, so that their industry will become far more efficient and, like, carbon neutral. And that really pushed them to develop, like, better technologies. Like for Sweden, like, they are one of the earliest countries to develop like low carbon steel or zero carbon steel that they're talking about it. And it's because of these carbon tax that's been there from 1990s in Sweden, pushed the industry to innovate and to come up with new technologies and processes. And that's really helping them now to remain competitive. Now, like Sweden, their embassies all around the world are, like, pushing for adapting to carbon neutral steel. And experts kind of, like, point out that we really need to keep $40 to $80 ton of carbon dioxide, and it's not only limited to certain countries, but it has to be a kind of a fully aligned all across, like, all the countries as a part of the Paris Agreement. If we really wanted to meet like 2 degrees Celsius goal, we are not even talking about 1.5 degrees Celsius, a 2 degrees Celsius goal. And so this will force the industry, like, if they wanted to kind of reduce their, keep their revenues intact, and like not their revenues kind of spilling out. So the best way for them is to make their industry carbon neutral in a relatively short time. And we are going to see more, there is a lot of discussion, like, in different countries. And this is from the latest World Bank report that was published last year on carbon pricing. And the report kind of highlighted, concluded that, like, in the next 2-3 years time, that we are going to see more and more countries will come up with different sorts of pricing mechanisms, or like, different trading mechanisms. The carbon trading is also another big thing, where, like, you can see China has like one of the largest trading mechanism. Like I guess like it's almost 2-3 billion tons of carbon is being now traded in China alone. So this is something that we are seeing carbon as a new commodity in the global market. And like banks, big institutions are all kind of like, trying to find a way to make money out of that one. And the other one, like, which is most favorite to all of you guys, is ESG. And thanks to it, thanks for ESG. It's kind of like long overdue. It should have been there for a very long time, so we could have really know what's happening with the big industries, big polluting industries like ExxonMobil and all of them. But now, like, all these industries are in the constant scrutiny by NGOs, by think tanks, and everyone to see where, how far they are doing. And like, even though they might have like net zero targets and everything, but their numbers really show like, whether they are going to whether they're going to achieve this net zero targets in that time. And this is a survey being done, like, the climate accounting and audit assessments of like, the 100 big companies, like which these 100 companies alone are responsible for 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And they did the survey. I mean, like, they look at their reports, like, based on the public listed companies. And they found that like, nearly all the companies did not really address the climate related risks in their reports. And now, like, with increasing requirements, like from the state, like, from stock exchanges, for them to report all these issues will make things like, much more tangible reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, because like, now they need to, if they really wanted to keep an interest of the investors, of their stakeholders and other shareholders, they really need to make a tangible reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. and take climate risk more seriously than what we have seen a few years back. And the transparency even from like activist groups, like, you know, from the UN, like through Global Compact Initiative, the Global Reporting Initiative, all these things are like, you know, making things easier. Like now, the one of the biggest one is TCFD, like, you know, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure, is one of the biggest developments in the financial industry, like where all the auditing companies must, like, you know, integrate climate risk into their financial statements. And all these things are like, you know, kind of create some sort of a virtuous feedback loops, and which will really force the industry to rapidly shift to carbon neutral. But again, like we are not expecting this to happen like by 2030 or mid 2040, or like, you know, early 2040. So we're going to take like considerable time. But these are all some early signs of like, you know, hope that things will eventually move forward. And but I hope, like, you know, we could able to not get into a situation of climate runaway where things will get really, really bad. And let's hope, like, you know, I want to end that with a positive note that things are looking slightly better than like what it used to be in 2014 and 15. And the industries are taking interest, and they see that like it's going to affect their businesses, their operations, and we're going to see some major developments in the next few years. And that's all I have. And like these are some of the references. Some of them are really good reports, particularly for ESG folks here. And you may find a lot of interesting material for you. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Absolutely. Many thanks, Dr. Said, for the profound and provoking presentation with a lot of data points and insights and frameworks for us to all chew upon and think about transitions in a systemic sense, especially on the corporate level, at the organization level, where often there are too many frameworks in place nowadays. So to often make sense of those frameworks as well is a challenge in itself. And there's certainly a lot to ask in the dialogue that we will have at the moment. At this point of time, we have a small pop-up survey which will come up on your screen. So feel free to essentially populate the survey, which will take about 30 seconds more. Yeah. So I welcome all the participants of the webinar to populate their feedback for the survey. And right now, after the survey, we'll have a small dialogue where I would invite all the participants of the webinar to ask Dr. Said their perspective, their feedback by either raising their hand and also afterwards to essentially to basically ask whatever they want to ask at the moment through popping in through the chat box or raising their hand. So I would like to use the moderator's privilege by asking the first probe. Honestly speaking, thank you so much, Dr. Said, for the insightful presentation. It was a lot to chew on. So I just wanted to ask one thing. For developing countries, how does climate transition fit in with basic aspects of energy security, for example? I traveled to South Africa last week, where there were power cuts or load shedding, as they call it, for 5 hours a day, because there wasn't enough power being produced by the thermal power plants or the nuclear power plants. So in this context, where a lot of the developing countries are struggling with energy equity, how does climate transition, especially energy intensive industries like power, right? Power generation is critical for climate transition as well as for quality of life. So aren't we missing the quality of life aspect in the entire transition equation?
No, it's absolutely true. I mean, like the developing countries, I guess, like this is where the climate negotiations goes back and asking about the historical responsibility and asking the developed countries to do far more than like what we really need to, the developing countries need to do. And again, the problem is that like, you know, we have the situation whether we really need to embrace the same industrial model of development that the Western countries have developed. And then as a consequence, what we are seeing it, and whether we need to amplify that one, are we going to kind of like, you know, take a different step to do it? Whether we really need like, you know, major centralized power stations, like, you know, we really need more decentralized power stations, like, you know, a different way of development that we really need to look at it. And this is the kind of a question that's been going on, but like overall, like, you know, the national policymakers, they see that the economies of scale and the benefit, the long-term benefits, they still go ahead with like, you know, big thermal power plants, and like, you know, because they really wanted to grow their economy and like, you know, focus on their development of their own people. And but we're going to end up like, you know, in a similar trap the Western countries have been ending up. And the good thing is that the renewables cost is coming down, and that's a really a good sign. And it's almost cost competitive when it comes to fossil fuel, natural gas power plants or coal-based power plants. And like with increasing carbon taxes, like, you know, with all these new regulations, like, you know, which will make fossil fuel industry to be far more expensive, like, you know, even like, you know, the most of the cost will go the shift to consumers rather than like on themselves. So this will make things a bit challenging. Like, you know, even if you want to have thermal power plants, like, you know, 5 years down the line, like, you know, it will be far more expensive than having a renewable based power. So we really need to rethink, like, you know, of more decentralized power generation, like many industries in many countries, like, you know, where that is possible. And also like, particularly if you're looking at like, you know, big heavy industries, we really need to find a different means. And this is where, like I was saying, that how some countries will respond, like, you know, each country will respond in a different way. And like, you know, some countries will take some of these actions, some of these technologies, like, you know, much later stages, like, you know, once the technology is extremely mature, more cost effective, like, you know, where the cost of production is extremely low, and then they're going to take those technologies rather than like, you know, they will start making those changes right at the beginning, because like, you know, they can't really afford it. Like, it's more of affordability rather than like, you know, they might have all the political will and the interests, but like, you know, it's purely a matter of economics. Like, you know, it's not possible for the kind of like, you know, companies like in Uganda or Kenya, South Africa, Pakistan, like look at the situation there. They can't really afford to have like carbon capture and storage with a thermal power plant. It's literally impossible. And for them, like, you know, the priority is just to provide basic access to electricity and all of them, rather than looking at like, you know, clean power. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the rather detailed probe. There is a question from a participant in in the chat. I think so. It's I think so. That's more of a comment rather than a probe. I'll rather continue with another probe which I have to ask. There were recent reports, Dr. Said, of the kind of minerals which are needed for renewable energy circuits, circulation, whether it is electromobility, whether it is solar panels, in terms of conflict minerals, in terms of minerals which are uh, a part of our supply chain, which is rather murky, right? It's not really a part of the entire narrative, the entire story. So how does this entire transitions framework account for the quote unquote negative externalities, if I'm allowed to borrow a term from economics?
No, it's extremely problematic. We don't see the supply chain issues at all.
I can't hear you.
So can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah?
we can hear you now.
I mean, like, this is a really big issue. Like, there is a book by The Rare Metals War, been written by a French journalist looking at, like, the economic consequences of, like, transition, particularly on critical minerals and all of that. One, yes, like, as much as we talk about electric vehicles and all of them, which, which I'm not entirely advocate of electric vehicles, because the amount of the critical minerals that you require from Congo and all of these basins is going to cause, like, vicious cycle of conflict, like displacement and dispossession. All of these things is going to happen. But again, invariably we're going to see that's the eventuality that most of the industries will look into it. And this is something that we face into kind of a quagmire, and how are we going to kind of address those externalities, like in our supply chain? And some people argue that, like, this is a kind of uh, uh, the option that we have, like, we're going to make some of these poisonous way of extraction, like, for a long-term development. But again, the long-term, the waste of, like, solar panels is also something that not many people have seen it. Like, we can go and talk about, like, solar and all of them, but, like, there are other consequences. The waste of solar is also a big issue that is quickly popping up, and we are seeing and again, like, this is where the circular economy ideas really come forth.
Yes,
like, how we develop technologies, that, like, that could be extremely recyclable again and again, rather than, like, it could be a one-time effect. And also making our products, like, much more repairable. Like, our Apple products, or any of these products are not kind of repairable. Like, we created in a planned obsolescence way, and which makes which difficult for us to recycle any of these products. And so there is a kind of a shift on our production processes. Like, if you really wanted to take into consideration, if you really wanted to reduce the impact, the long-term impact of minerals, the rare earth minerals and everything, and we really need to change our business models. So again, this is something that we don't really see. It's like, this is where the industries, like, who are developing these products and products, like, we really need to integrate a genuine circular economy principles, like, into their operations. Else, like, we're going to whatever the emissions that's been displaced, like, on the supply end or the user end, is going to be shifted, like, onto the producer's end, like, which we don't see it, like, on the other side of it. And it's kind of creating some sort of, like, other loops of emissions. And again, many activists, and many of them, they fail to look at those picture and the supply chain aspect of it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Said, for the detailed analysis and for the answers as well. We have certainly learned a lot from this session and from our conversations over here. I would rather let the participants, in case they have any particular probe, to basically raise their hand and unmute and ask anything what they want to ask Dr. Said, and we can take the conversation forward. If not, I would ask another. Okay, Pradeep sir, please go ahead, sir.
I have a small question for Dr. Said. He mentioned in his talk about energy. I mean, in Europe recently, for the last maybe 1 year, 1.5 years, it has become more like a security issue rather than carbon issue in Europe. I would like that if you can elaborate a little bit on that. That's question one. And also that second question, which is a little different, the whole lot of transition, which would take probably next 30 to 40 years or maybe 50 years. What kind of cost estimates, the experts have put in for this transition globally in terms of reaching to the objective of 1.5 or net zero carbon and so on and so forth? These are two small questions.
Okay, for Europe question, like, if you look at the Europe has been, like, historically very active, like, on the climate front. Like, even if you look at the climate negotiations, like, right from 1992 in the Rio, up until, like, the Paris agreements, like EU, unlike the US, like, which has always been intransigent, like, in terms of making more drastic policies. Like, EU, they see there is some benefit for their own economy to remain competitive. They started Green New Deal like earlier, like a few years back, and all the countries like EU has directives on ETS. Although it's not a full success, but still the ETS is a European trading system, like where the emissions have been traded in the market. They had other directives like at European that forced all the European countries to have to reduce their emissions like by 30 to 40% at 1990 level. And so because of that, they realized their historical responsibility, and which was enshrined in the UNFCCC preamble, and they agreed to it. But in the last few years, because again, if you look at Europe, most of these countries are dependent on Russia's natural gas. And the crisis, the aftermath of the Ukrainian invasion, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, created a huge geopolitical dynamics, and where the energy supply has become a huge issue, and the country, they no longer want to depend on Russia's natural gas. And this happened in 2014, like during the Crimea annexation, and many people highlighted that you really need to take climate transition as a security concern, because so that you will stop depending on natural gas. And many people kind of, it's not such a big concern. Will change the whole narrative of natural gas as a transition fuel from coal, we'll move to natural gas, before we completely turn into renewables. But back then the renewables were still very expensive, it was not cost competitive, when you look at comparatively with the fossil fuels energy generation. But in the last 5 years' time, the cost has plunged drastically, and the cost of production of solar power has been natural gas. It's more or less very utopian that you can completely abandon all the infrastructure that they have, the natural gas base. We are totally down all these assets, because these assets are very long-lived assets that takes 20 years, for them to mature, completely stop producing it. But for them, they just see there is no other option for now. We will slowly, we'll kind of prioritize renewable energy, the Green New Deal as one of the key policy documents now, to completely shift to renewables, where they integrate the security element. We no longer need to depend on Russia, and where we will going to face the same problems again and again. And this is where the decarbonizers become more of a angle rather than purely from an environmental, the Annex 1 countries' commitments. And we are seeing some changes, and we are going to see a tiny blip in increase in greenhouse gas emissions, because Netherlands, Germany, Poland, and all of them has increased their coal-based power generation. They restarted their coal-based, because there is those quick starts, they can start much quickly compared to renewables setting up the whole thing. And also the renewables has a disadvantage. They don't have enough solar radiation compared to the countries that we see in tropical climates and other countries. So they still need some other external power source, that could continue to support their economy. The Germany, we have seen thousands of, hundreds of millions of dollars and euros have been lost, because of the increase in power cost, the energy cost, and shut down for a few months, because they don't really have enough feedstock for them, the chemical companies, the automotive companies, for them to run it. And so these are all becoming major geopolitical issues. And so these are all eventually contributing to some sort of a positive dynamic, to transition. But we're going to see some quick rise in greenhouse gas emissions for the next 2 to 5 years. And then eventually we're going to see a rapid reduction from European Union. And for the second question, yes, there is a kind of price tag that's been put, IEA and the IPCC always comes up with some tags. They said, at least we need 10 to 15 trillion dollars, by 2030, if we really wanted to kind of decarbonize it. The IRENA published, the International Renewable Energy Agency, they published the report called the 2050 Major Energy Transformation, and they had some similar numbers. At times, the numbers inflate to $15 to $20 trillion, like, each year that needs to be invested. Like if we wanted to see the temperature to be well below, like, 2 degrees Celsius. And this is something we are talking about, like, 2030, and that investments need to increase like by 2040 and 2050. And if we wanted to see complete decarbonization of the energy systems, I will send you the reports, like in terms of that report, which has those numbers. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the dialogue, Pradeep sir and Dr. Said over here. In case we don't have any further probes from the participants, I would take this opportunity to thank Dr. Said and also pass on the virtual floor to our partner, Mr. Pradeep Malu, for some observations and to take the conversation forward.
Thank you, Mani. And it's been wonderful in 45 minutes, Dr. Said, the way you explain the kind of serious problem which we are sitting on and how it is to be addressed. It is not local, but it's a global issue. I mean, it's been in 45 minutes, you've been, you told us so many things which would require maybe days, months, and years work, And that's been really, really wonderful. And we indeed feel so blessed to have you with us this afternoon, late afternoon. And thank you so much from us, from the firm. And thank you all the participants as well for joining us on this Friday afternoon, late afternoon webinar. And stay in touch with us. Many more would be coming in on similar and exciting topics. And like what we talk about ESG. Thank you. Thank you, Mani. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Mr. Pradeep, and thank
you
Mani,
so much, Dr. Said and Pradeep sir, for the comments, inputs, and for the lively conversation that we have. We have to certainly continue this dialogue. This is not a one-off. And we will be having more webinars on similar ESG topics in the subsequent weeks. So please keep in touch, and we would be sharing our forthcoming webinars via email and on the social media feeds. And in the coming week, this webinar will be up on our website very, very soon. So we will be happy to share a copy of the link of the recording as well for your teams, for your classmates, and to engage in such rich conversations on the climate transition, which is a need of the hour and a need of our times. So many thanks all of you for being here. We will surely have the conversation going and have a nice evening ahead from us over here in Mumbai, and afternoon certainly in the Middle East. Thank you so much. Well, as they say in the Middle East, shukran jazilan and masalama, and thank you so much.
I wanted to show this book, like if anyone wanted
to. Okay, wonderful. The
rare metal war.
The rare metal war. Okay.
The dark side of clean energy and digital technologies. It was written by a French journalist called Guillaume Pétron. It's a fantastic book. Like, it will give you another side of the picture of, like, the so-called, like, the miraculous renewable technologies, but it's just good to always have an understanding what happens on the other side as well. Yeah,
it's nice to have a view of both the sides of the transition, and we will certainly look the book up. And thank you very much for the suggestion. We will be in touch, and thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Take care. Bye bye.
Have a good day.